7-year-old Jamal Washington stepped between the bullies and a girl he barely knew. 3 against 1. Fists flew. Blood dripped. He took every hit without crying out. What Jamal didn't know, that little girl's father wore a patch most people feared. And when Marcus Carter got the call that someone had protected his daughter, Aaliyah, he made a single phone call. By dawn, 670 motorcycles would roll into that small town. The school principal's hands were shaking when he saw what was coming down Main Street. Before we dive into the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means so much and helps us keep bringing you more amazing stories like this one. Jamal Washington wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention. At 7 years old, he was small for his age, the kind of boy who preferred sketching in his notebook during recess rather than joining the chaos of the playground. His 3rd-grade classroom was his sanctuary, a place where being quiet wasn't a weakness, but simply who he was. He had a gift for noticing things others missed, the way light caught the edge of a desk, the pattern of cracks in the ceiling tiles, the loneliness in someone's eyes. That's how he first noticed Aaliyah Carter. It was a Thursday afternoon when he saw her sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria table, her lunch untouched, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The next day, the same thing. And the day after that, 3 days of isolation that most kids wouldn't have registered. But Jamal saw it. He recognized something in her solitude that mirrored his own, not the comfortable kind of being alone, but the heavy kind that pressed down on small shoulders. Aaliyah was different from the other kids, and difference in elementary school might as well be a target painted on your back. Her jacket was worn leather, patches sewn on by hand. Her lunchbox had motorcycle decals. She didn't talk much, and when she did, there was a guardedness in her voice that suggested she'd learned early that words could be used against you. Jamal had no idea what he was about to walk into would change everything. The afternoon bell rang, releasing a flood of children onto the playground. Jamal gathered his things slowly, watching through the classroom window as Aaliyah made her way towards the swing sets at the far edge of the yard. She walked with her head down, hands tucked into her pockets, trying to be invisible, but 3 8th-graders had already spotted her. Ethan Brooks was the kind of bully who'd learned cruelty from watching the adults in his life wield power without consequence. He was 13, bigger than most kids his age, and he'd surrounded himself with 2 followers who laughed at his jokes and validated his worst instincts. They moved toward Aaliyah like predators who'd identified the weakest member of the herd. Jamal watched from 30 FT away as Ethan grabbed the sleeve of Aaliyah's jacket, jerking her backward. "Nice jacket, freak. Your weirdo biker dad give you that." The words carried across the playground, sharp and designed to wound. Aaliyah tried to pull away, but Ethan's grip tightened. His friends circled closer, blocking her escape routes, their laughter harsh and ugly. "I bet he's in a gang," one of them sneered, shoving Aaliyah's shoulder. She stumbled, catching herself against the swing set pole. "Does he beat people up? Is that what bikers do?" Another shove, harder this time. Aaliyah's eyes were wide now, scanning for a teacher, for help, for anyone. But the playground monitors were on the other side of the yard, breaking up a different conflict, oblivious to what was unfolding in the shadows of the swing sets. Jamal's hands were shaking. Every instinct told him to look away, to stay safe, to be invisible like he'd always been. But something stronger rose in his chest. A conviction that watching wrong happen and doing nothing made you part of the wrong. His feet moved before his mind fully decided, carrying him across those 30 ft of playground concrete toward 3 boys who outweighed him by 40 lb each. "Leave her alone." His voice came out smaller than he'd hoped, but it came out. That was something. Ethan turned, surprise flickering across his face before it twisted into something darker. A new target had just volunteered itself, and bullies never passed up an opportunity like that. If you've ever stood up for someone weaker, you understand what Jamal did. Comment, respect, if you believe in protecting others. What Jamal didn't know was that Aliyah's father was already on his way to the school. The school nurse's office smelled of antiseptic and institutional worry. Jamal sat on the examination table, his shirt stained with blood that had poured from his broken nose. The nurse worked quietly, her hands gentle, but her face tight with anger at what had been allowed to happen on school grounds. Broken nose, cracked rib, bruising that would turn his small torso into a canvas of purple and yellow for weeks to come. Each injury was catalogued, documented, evidence of a violence that should never have touched a 7-year-old body. Keisha Washington arrived 23 minutes after the call, her work apron still tied around her waist, flour dusting her forearms from the bakery where she'd been in the middle of her shift. She was a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment and food on the table, and the sight of her son's battered face shattered something fundamental in her. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, tears streaming down her cheeks as she took in the split lip, the swollen eye, the way he winced when she touched his side. "Baby, what happened? Who did this to you?" Her voice broke on the words, maternal anguish flooding every syllable. But Jamal, even through his pain, even with his body screaming from what he'd endured, looked up at his mother with eyes full of worry that wasn't for himself. "Is Aliyah okay, Mom? Did they hurt her? I tried to make sure she could run. Is she safe?" The nurse had to look away, overwhelmed by the selflessness of a child who'd taken a beating to protect someone else and couldn't stop thinking about whether he'd succeeded. Keisha pulled her son close as carefully as his injuries would allow and wept into his hair. This boy, her beautiful, gentle boy who drew pictures and read books and never raised his voice, had stepped between violence and another child. Pride and heartbreak warred in her chest, 2 emotions so intertwined she couldn't separate them. While Keisha held her son, a very different scene unfolded in Principal Harlan's office down the hall. The 3 bullies sat in chairs lined against the wall, Ethan Brooks in the center, his expression a careful mask of teenage indifference. Their parents had been called, and they'd arrived with the speed that money and influence provided. The Brooks walked in first. Mr. Brooks, in his tailored suit, still on the clock from his law firm downtown. Mrs. Brooks in tennis whites, inconvenienced by the interruption to her afternoon. The other parents followed, equally polished, equally prepared to protect their children from consequence. Principal Harlan, a man who'd spent 23 years in education and had learned when to fight and when to fold, began explaining the situation. 3 8th graders had attacked a 3rd grader. The injuries were severe. There would need to be consequences. But before he could finish, Mr. Brooks leaned forward, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent a career bending systems to his will. "Principal Harlan, let's be very clear about something. Boys will be boys. Playground scuffles happen. If you're suggesting my son should face suspension or any permanent mark on his record over a schoolyard disagreement, I should inform you that my firm has handled several cases against this school district. We'd hate to add another." The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and effective. The other parents nodded. A united front of wealth and connection, and the unshakable belief that their children's futures mattered more than justice. Principal Harlan felt his resolve crumble. The school board wouldn't back him, not against families like these. He'd seen it happen before, watched consequences evaporate when the right last names were involved. He began negotiating down from suspension to detention, from permanent records to stern warnings, from accountability to nothing that mattered. The system was failing in real time, spineless and predictable. But there was one parent they hadn't called yet, one father who hadn't been informed that his daughter had been cornered, terrorized, and saved by a 7-year-old boy who'd paid in blood for his courage. Marcus Carter's phone rang at 3:47 in the afternoon. He was in his garage, hands deep in the engine of a 1972 Harley, when he heard his daughter's voice crack through the speaker. Aaliyah was crying, the kind of sobbing that comes from fear finally released from a dam of emotions breaking all at once. "Daddy, a boy got hurt really bad because of me." Marcus's hands stilled on the engine. His voice, when he spoke, was calm in the way that dangerous men are calm when they're calculating their next move. "Tell me everything, Princess. Slow down. Tell me what happened." And Aaliyah did. She told him about the bullies, about being cornered, about Jamal Washington stepping between her and the violence, about how small he was, how brave, how he told her to run while he took hit after hit, about how the school nurse had called an ambulance, how Jamal's nose was broken, how he'd protected her with his own body, and about how the school was doing nothing, how the bullies' parents were in the principal's office right now making it all go away. Marcus listened to every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her, just let his daughter tell him about the injustice she'd witnessed and the courage that had saved her. When she finished, when her voice had gone hoarse from crying, Marcus's response was measured and quiet. "I'll handle it, Princess. You did good telling me. Everything's going to be okay." He hung up and stood in his garage for a long moment, his jaw set, his mind already moving through what came next. That phone call would set in motion something this town had never experienced. Marcus Carter walked back into his garage and pulled out his phone. The contacts list read like a map of the southern seaboard. Names and numbers of men who'd ridden together, bled together, stood as brothers for decades. He started with his own chapter vice president, then moved outward like ripples in water. Atlanta first. "A kid protected my daughter and paid the price. The school won't do right. We will." The response was immediate. "How many do you need?" "All of them," Marcus said. "Every brother who can ride." Savannah was next, then Charleston, Birmingham, Nashville. Each call carried the same message, the same quiet fury, the same request. This wasn't about revenge. This was about showing a small town that when systems fail, when adults choose comfort over courage, when money silences justice, there are still people who remember what it means to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. The word spread through the brotherhood like wildfire through dry grass. Chapter calling chapter brothers, reaching out to brothers. The network activating with a speed that came from years of loyalty and shared purpose. By midnight, 670 brothers had confirmed they were riding at dawn. From 5 states they would come, converging on a small Georgia town that had no idea what was about to roll down its main street. Bikes were being fueled, leathers were being pulled from closets, and men who worked construction and drove trucks and owned businesses and served as veterans were preparing to make a statement that couldn't be ignored. But before the dawn, before the thunder of 670 engines, Marcus had someone he needed to meet. He arrived at the Washington apartment that evening just as the sun was setting, his motorcycle rumbling to a stop outside their building. Keisha Washington opened the door with Jamal behind her, the boy's face a patchwork of bruises and bandages. Keisha's expression was guarded, wary. She'd seen the news, heard the stories, knew the reputation that came with the patches Marcus wore. Her instinct was to protect her son, and this man represented a world she'd been taught to fear. Marcus saw her hesitation and understood it. He took off his sunglasses, held her gaze with respect, and spoke quietly. "Mrs. Washington, my name is Marcus Carter. That's my daughter Aaliyah that your son protected today. I came to say thank you, and to meet the bravest kid I've ever heard of." Keisha's shoulders relaxed slightly, enough to step aside and let him enter. Marcus moved into their small living room with a gentleness that contradicted every stereotype, lowering himself to one knee so he could look Jamal in the eye at his level. "You protected my little girl," Marcus said, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't know her, you didn't know me. You just saw someone who needed help and you stepped up. That makes you family." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a coin worn smooth from years of carrying. The chapter emblem etched into the metal. It was his personal coin, the one given to him when he'd earned his patch, the one he carried for luck and memory. He pressed it into Jamal's small palm and closed the boy's fingers around it. Real courage isn't about being big or strong. It's about doing what's right when everything tells you to walk away. You've got more courage in this little body than most grown men I know. Jamal looked down at the coin, then up at Marcus, and something passed between them that transcended words. Recognition, respect, the understanding that character isn't measured in size or age, but in the choices we make when it costs us something. Marcus stood and turned to Keisha. Tomorrow morning, we're visiting the school. Not for violence, for justice. There are some things that need to be said. Some people who need to understand that protecting bullies because their parents have money isn't acceptable. Will you trust me? Keisha looked at her son, his face bruised from doing the right thing. Then at this leather-clad stranger who'd shown Jamal more respect in 5 minutes than the school board had shown all day. She thought about Principal Harlan's weak excuses, about the Brookses' threats about a system that had failed her boy completely. She looked back at Marcus and nodded. If you think the school failed Jamal, hit that subscribe button. Cowards shouldn't get away with this. Neither of them could imagine what the next morning would bring. The rumble began at 5:47 in the morning. From Atlanta, a column of 83 motorcycles rolled onto Interstate 75, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a river of light. From Savannah, 97 brothers headed west on Route 16, their engines creating a symphony of raw power that echoed off the surrounding hills. Charleston sent 112. Birmingham contributed 78, and from Nashville, 200 riders made their way south through the morning mist. They converged on small-town Georgia from 5 different directions. A coordinated movement of 670 motorcycles that transformed quiet highways into thoroughfares of purpose. Gas station attendants along the routes stopped mid-transaction to watch as wave after wave of Hell's Angels passed through. At a truck stop outside Macon, a young clerk counted 19 groups of bikes before she lost track. Each cluster maintaining careful formation, each rider focused and deliberate. State police monitoring the movements radioed back and forth, tracking the convergence. But there were no laws being broken, no speeding, no reckless driving, just an overwhelming force moving with military precision toward a single destination. Most people assumed 670 bikers means violence. They were about to learn something different. Principal Harlan arrived at school at 7:15 for what he believed would be a normal Tuesday. He parked in his reserved spot, coffee in hand, already mentally preparing for the parent-teacher conferences scheduled for later that week. He was halfway to the entrance when he heard it, the distant growl of a motorcycle engine, then another, then 10 more. He turned toward the sound, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, and watched as the first bikes appeared at the end of the street. Then 50 more materialized behind them, then 100, then the entire street filled with motorcycles, a sea of chrome and leather stretching 3 blocks in every direction. The rumble was deafening now, not chaotic, but controlled, powerful in its unity. Harlan's face went white. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers, splashing onto the pavement in a dark stain he didn't notice. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and called the superintendent. "We have a situation," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he called the police. "I need officers at the school now. There are hundreds of them." But the officers who arrived took one look at the scene and radioed back that there was no disturbance, no threat, no laws being violated, just presence. Overwhelming, undeniable presence. Marcus Carter dismounted from his bike at exactly 7:30. 670 brothers cut their engines in unison, and suddenly the morning was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the tick of cooling metal. Marcus removed his helmet slowly, deliberately, and began walking toward the school entrance. Behind him stretched a formation that looked like something out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on which side of justice you stood on. Leather vests adorned with patches, American flags mounted on handlebars. Men of every age and background united by a code that valued loyalty, honor, and protection of the innocent above all else. The scene was surreal. No one was shouting. No one was threatening. There was no aggression in their postures, no violence in their eyes. Just an absolute, unshakable presence that communicated a simple message. We are here. We are watching. And things are about to change. Students arriving for school stopped on the sidewalks, mouths open in awe. Teachers froze in their tracks. Parents getting out of their cars stood paralyzed, uncertain whether to protect their children or simply witness what was unfolding. Marcus reached the school's front steps and stopped. He didn't need to say anything yet. The silence spoke volumes. 70 sets of eyes watched Principal Harlan standing in the doorway, watched the police officers standing uncertainly at the perimeter, watched the community realize that the comfortable order they'd maintained was about to be disrupted. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Marcus's voice, carried across the morning air, calm and unshakable. Principal Harlan, I'd like to request a school-wide assembly. We have something important to discuss with your students and staff. It wasn't really a request, and everyone present understood that. Harlan looked at the 670 men standing in perfect formation, looked at the police officers who'd made it clear they wouldn't intervene in a peaceful gathering, and realized he had no choice. He was terrified, his hands trembling as he pulled out his keys to unlock the main doors. But he was also legally required to maintain order and ensure student safety. An assembly controlled and contained was better than the alternative his panicked mind was imagining. The gymnasium filled in a way it had never filled before. Students filed in their conversations hushed and uncertain, eyes wide as they took in the scene unfolding around them. Teachers gathered in nervous clusters, unsure of their role in whatever was about to happen. And then the bikers entered 6 to 70 strong, lining the walls of the gymnasium, and rose 3 deep. They stood with military bearing, hands clasped in front of them, faces serious but not threatening. The image was surreal and powerful, a basketball court surrounded by leather and patches. Teenage students sitting in bleachers ringed by men who represented everything their suburban lives had taught them to fear. Jamal and Keisha Washington were escorted to front row seats. A position of honor that Principal Harlan hadn't authorized but didn't dare challenge. Keisha held Jamal's hand tightly, her other arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. The boy's bruised face served as a silent testament to why they were all there, a living reminder of courage and consequence. Marcus Carter walked to the center of the gymnasium floor. He didn't need a microphone. His voice carried naturally, trained by years of speaking to large groups in open spaces. The room fell into absolute silence. Hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting to understand what this moment meant. Marcus's voice, when he spoke, was firm but measured, the tone of a man who'd thought carefully about every word he was about to say. My name is Marcus Carter. I'm Leah Carter's father. 3 days ago, my daughter was cornered by 3 8th-grade boys on your playground. They mocked her, pushed her, terrorized her because she was different, because her family was different, and a 7-year-old boy named Jamal Washington, who barely knew my daughter, stepped between her and those bullies. He told them to leave her alone. And for that act of courage, for that moment of standing up when every adult here failed to, he was beaten, broken nose, cracked rib, bruises that will take weeks to heal. Marcus paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembly. Jamal showed more courage in that moment than the adults in charge of protecting him. He's 7 years old, and he understood something that apparently needed to be taught to the grown-ups in this building. You don't walk away when someone weaker needs protection. You don't stay silent when you see injustice. You stand up even when it costs you something. His gaze swept across the gymnasium, landing briefly on Principal Harlan, on the teachers who'd been inside while Jamal was bleeding outside, on the students who'd watched and done nothing. Yesterday, the parents of those 3 bullies came to this school. They threatened lawsuits. They invoked their connections and their wealth. They made it clear that their sons would face no real consequences for what they did. And this school, this institution that's supposed to teach children about right and wrong, folded it. Boys will be boys, they said. Just a schoolyard scuffle. They said the bullies got detention. Jamal got an ambulance. Remember that phone call from Aliyah? This is why Marcus made it. The truth needed to be spoken in a room where everyone had to listen, where the comfortable lies couldn't survive in the face of 670 witnesses who'd ridden through the night to stand for something that mattered. The school board chose power over principle, Marcus continued. They chose protecting wealthy families over protecting a child who demonstrated the kind of character they claimed to be teaching. That ends today. His voice hardened slightly, not with threat, but with absolute conviction. But we're not here for revenge. We're not here for violence. We're here to show Jamal and every kid in this school who's ever been bullied, who's ever felt alone, who's ever wondered if doing the right thing matters. We're here to show you that it does. Nobody expected what came next. Marcus reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope, holding it up for the assembly to see. The Brotherhood has established a scholarship fund for Jamal Washington. We're putting him through college, full ride, every penny, from elementary school support through his bachelor's degree. Because courage like his deserves to be rewarded, deserves to be celebrated, deserves to be given every opportunity to flourish. The gymnasium erupted in whispers, students turning to each other in disbelief, teachers exchanging glances of shock. But Marcus wasn't finished. We're also donating $50,000 to this school's anti-bullying program. Another wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, but Marcus's next words cut through them like a knife. With one condition, real consequences for bullies, regardless of how much money their parents have. Zero tolerance means zero tolerance. If you assault another student, you face suspension, expulsion if warranted, and legal consequences were appropriate. Your last name doesn't buy you immunity. Your father's law firm doesn't erase what you did. Actions have consequences, and it's time this school remembered that. If you believe actions should have consequences, comment justice. Bullies need to know the world is watching. Marcus's voice cut through the gymnasium one more time, and this time there was steel beneath the measured tone. Ethan Brooks, step forward and bring your 2 friends with you. The 3 8th graders who'd been sitting in the bleachers trying to disappear into the crowd felt 670 sets of eyes turn toward them simultaneously. The weight of that attention was crushing, inescapable. They stood on shaking legs and made their way down to the gymnasium floor, each step feeling like a walk through fire. They stood before Marcus, 3 boys who suddenly looked very small despite being 13 years old. Despite outweighing Jamal Washington by 40 dantawudum each, Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in that gymnasium was absolute, every person present leaning forward to hear what would happen next. You hurt someone weaker because you could, Marcus said, his words direct and unadorned. You saw a little girl who was different, who couldn't fight back, and you decided to make her suffer for it. When a 7-year-old boy stepped up to protect her, you beat him bloody. That doesn't make you strong. That doesn't make you tough. That makes you a coward. The word hung in the air like an indictment. Ethan Brooks's face flushed red, but he couldn't look away from Marcus's steady gaze. We're a brotherhood because we protect the weak, Marcus continued. We stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. We use whatever strength we have to make sure the vulnerable are safe. That's what real men do. That's what real strength looks like. What you did, that's what weakness looks like. That's what happens when you have power, but no character. The education was brutal in its simplicity. Each word stripping away the bravado and excuses these boys had wrapped themselves in. They stood there exposed and accountable in a way they'd never been before. And the discomfort radiating from them was palpable. For everyone watching, especially those who'd been bullied themselves, there was a deep satisfaction in seeing the tables turned in watching power used not for cruelty, but for justice. "Now you're going to apologize to Jamal," Marcus said in front of everyone here. "And it's going to be real because 670 men just rode through the night to make sure you understand that what you did matters." He gestured toward Jamal, still sitting in the front row beside his mother, his bruised face a testament to his courage. The three boys turned toward him, and for a long moment, no one moved. Ethan opened his mouth, but before he could speak, his father's voice cut through from somewhere in the crowd. "Now wait just a minute, mister." Brooks was pushing his way forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in, ready to protect his son from this public humiliation. But he stopped mid-sentence when 670 bikers shifted their attention to him. There were no words, no threats, just a collective look that communicated everything that needed to be said. Mr. Brooks's face went pale, and he took a step backward, then another, melting back into the crowd in silence. Ethan turned back to Jamal, and this time when he spoke, the words came from a place of genuine fear that had cracked open something resembling remorse. "Jamal, I'm sorry. What I did was wrong. You were trying to help Aaliyah, and I hurt you. For it. I'm sorry." His voice shook, and tears were forming in his eyes. Fear has a way of teaching respect when nothing else will. And in that moment, standing before a child he'd brutalized, and 670 men who'd made it clear that such behavior would never go unanswered again, Ethan Brooks understood consequences for perhaps the first time in his privileged life. The other two boys followed, their apologies equally shaken, equally genuine. Jamal nodded slowly, accepting their words with a dignity that belied his 7 years. There was catharsis in the moment, a sense of justice being served not through violence, but through accountability, through the simple but powerful act of making wrongdoers face what they'd done in front of a community that refused to look away. But Marcus wasn't done yet. He turned his full attention to the three boys, his voice dropping lower, more personal. "You have two choices from this moment forward. You can learn from this. You can become better. You can prove that you're more than your worst moment. You can be the kind of men who protect instead of harm, who stand up for others instead of tearing them down. That path is open to you, and nobody here wants to see you fail at it." He paused, letting that possibility settle, "where you can keep being cowards. You can go back to using your size and your parents' money to hurt people weaker than you. But know this, Jamal has 670 brothers now. You touch him again. You touch all of us. You go after Aaliyah again. You go after any kid in this school who can't defend themselves. And we'll be back. Not for violence, but for accountability. And next time, the whole country will be watching." The warning carried the weight of absolute certainty, a promise and a boundary drawn in unmovable lines. It wasn't a threat of harm. It was something more powerful. It was the assurance that actions would have consequences, that bullies could no longer hide behind wealth and influence, that there were people willing to stand up and make sure justice meant something. The three boys nodded, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the gymnasium, in the school, in the understanding of what would and wouldn't be tolerated going forward. When Marcus dismissed the assembly, something unexpected happened. Instead of the gymnasium emptying in fearful silence, students began approaching the bikers, not with terror, but with curiosity. A tentative hand raised here. A quiet question asked there, And suddenly the walls that separated leather-clad brotherhood from suburban childhood began to dissolve. A teenage girl asked one of the older bikers about the patches on his vest, and he explained each one with patience and pride. The chapter he belonged to, the rides he'd completed, the charities they supported. She listened, fascinated, her preconceptions crumbling with every word. A group of middle school boys gathered around a veteran who wore his military service patches alongside his club colors. He told them about serving overseas, about what brotherhood meant when your life depended on the person next to you, about bringing those values home and finding them again in the motorcycle community. His voice was gentle but firm, and the boys hung on every word, seeing for perhaps the first time that strength and kindness weren't opposites, but companions. Fathers in the club talked about their own children, about why they dropped everything to ride through the night for a 7-year-old they'd never met. "Because that's what you do," one of them said simply. "You protect family." And when a kid shows that kind of courage, he becomes family. Teachers who'd stood frozen in fear an hour earlier now found themselves in conversations that challenged everything they'd assumed. A history teacher learned that the man she was talking to held a master's degree and taught at a community college. A guidance counselor discovered that another brother ran a youth mentorship program in Atlanta. The stereotypes that had filled the gymnasium when those 670 bikes first arrived were crumbling in real time, replaced by something more complex and human. The understanding that people couldn't be reduced to their appearance, that brotherhood meant something deeper than danger, that the patches and leather represented a code of honor that many had forgotten existed. Aaliyah Carter stood beside her father, watching the transformation with wide eyes. Jamal Washington, still hurting but no longer alone, found himself surrounded by bikers who wanted to shake his hand to tell him he'd done good, to make sure he understood that his courage mattered. The gymnasium had become something entirely different from what it had been an hour before. Not a place of confrontation, but of connection. Not a battlefield, but a bridge between worlds that had never tried to understand each other. Outside the school, local news vans began arriving. Cameras rolled as reporters tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. They'd expected a story about intimidation, about a biker gang descending on a school in force. What they found instead was harder to categorize and far more compelling. By evening, the story had gone regional. Georgia news stations leading with footage of Jamal Washington surrounded by protective brothers, of Marcus Carter explaining the scholarship fund, of a community being forced to confront its failure to protect a child. By the next day, it had gone national. Major networks picked it up, and the narrative that emerged wasn't what anyone had anticipated. The headlines didn't read, "Biker gang invades school." They read, "Community stands up for bullied child." They read, "670 Hells Angels ride to honor 7-year-old hero." They read, "When systems fail, brotherhood steps in." The story captured something people were hungry for, proof that ordinary acts of courage still mattered, that there were still people willing to stand up when institutions failed, that justice didn't always come from the top down, but sometimes rolled in on 670 motorcycles from 5 different states. The power of so many showing up for one small boy resonated across the country, sparking conversations about bullying, about accountability, about what it really means to protect the vulnerable. But the real change was just beginning. The school board convened an emergency meeting 72 hours after 670 motorcycles rolled away from their campus. The national attention had transformed a local incident into a PR nightmare that couldn't be managed away with carefully worded statements and quiet settlements. Parents were calling. The superintendent's office was flooded with emails. News crews were still camped outside the school gates. Something had to change, and it had to change visibly. New anti-bullying policies were drafted and approved within a week. Mandatory teacher training was scheduled. Not the perfunctory workshops they'd done before, but comprehensive programs about recognizing abuse, intervening effectively, and creating cultures of accountability. The zero-tolerance policy was rewritten with teeth in it. Explicit language that consequences would apply to all students, regardless of family status, wealth, or connections. No more boys will be boys. No more looking the other way because a parent threatened legal action. Principal Harlan, who'd spent 23 years in education but had failed the most basic test of protecting a child, was quietly reassigned to an administrative position where he'd never oversee students again. The changes were systematic, documented, and irreversible, carved into policy by the glare of national scrutiny and the knowledge that 670 witnesses were watching to see if words became actions. When Jamal Washington returned to school 2 weeks after the assembly, something fundamental had shifted in him. The bruises were fading, yellow now instead of purple. But the real change wasn't physical. He walked differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that came from being seen, from being valued, from understanding that his courage had mattered. He no longer kept his eyes down in the hallways. He no longer tried to make himself invisible. Aaliyah Carter became his best friend. Their bond forged in that moment on the playground when he'd chosen to stand between her and harm. They ate lunch together, worked on art projects side by side, and became inseparable in the way that shared trauma and mutual protection creates unbreakable connections. Other kids noticed the ones who'd been bullied, who'd eaten alone, who'd learned to stay quiet and hope the predators picked someone else. They found their voices. A 5th grader reported harassment that had been going on for months. A 6th grader spoke up when he saw a smaller kid being cornered. The culture shifted because Jamal had shown them what was possible, and because the school, under the weight of national attention and a $50,000 donation with strings attached, actually started enforcing consequences. Remember that shy artist from the beginning? Watch what courage unlocked. Not just in him, but in every child who'd been waiting for permission to believe that standing up mattered. Ethan Brooks's transformation began quietly, almost invisibly. His parents were humiliated by the national attention. Their names dragged through news cycles and social media threads about privilege and accountability. They threatened lawsuits, then withdrew them when their lawyers explained that suing over being held accountable for assault wasn't the victory they imagined. But Ethan himself experienced something different. Something had changed when 670 men showed him what real strength looked like. Not domination, but protection. Not cruelty, but courage. He started small, sitting with a kid who ate alone in the cafeteria. Nothing dramatic, just choosing a different table one day and striking up a conversation about video games, stopping his friends mid-sentence when they started mocking another student's clothes, saying quietly, "That's not cool, man. Leave it." The redemption wasn't instant or complete. Patterns carved over years don't disappear overnight. But the possibility was there, nurtured by the memory of standing in front of a gymnasium full of people who'd made him face what he'd done, and then offered him a path to become something better. Marcus Carter became a fixture in Jamal Washington's life in the weeks and months that followed. Saturday mornings meant the rumble of a motorcycle pulling up outside their apartment, and Jamal would race to the window to see Marcus waiting with a specially fitted sidecar attached to his bike. They'd ride through the countryside, Jamal's small frame secure in the protective shell, his face lit up with joy as the wind rushed past and the world opened up in ways it never had before. During those rides, Marcus taught him things that went beyond mechanics and horsepower. He taught him about brotherhood, how it meant showing up when someone needed you, how it meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, how it meant being accountable to something larger than your own comfort. He taught Jamal about respect, about standing up without using violence, about how real strength was measured not in how many fights you won, but in how many you prevented. The lessons weren't lectures, but conversations, stories shared over diner breakfasts after long rides. Wisdom passed down from a man who'd learned hard truths and wanted to spare this boy from learning them the hardest way. Keisha Washington watched her son flourish under this mentorship with gratitude that sometimes brought tears to her eyes. She was a single mother who'd done everything she could, but she knew Jamal needed a male role model, someone who could teach him what honor looked like in action. Marcus filled that role with a gentleness that contradicted every stereotype she'd ever held about men who wore those patches. Jamal's story, meanwhile, rippled far beyond one small town in Georgia. The national coverage had reached brothers and chapters across the country, and in clubs from California to Maine, conversations were happening about what they'd witnessed. The Brotherhood had always supported causes: toy drives at Christmas, charity rides for veterans, fundraisers for families in need. But Jamal's courage had sparked something different, something more focused. One 7-year-old's courage created something nobody expected. The Hells Angels announced the launch of the stand-up program in a press conference that drew media from around the world. It was a nationwide initiative designed to reward children who protected others, who showed courage in the face of bullying, who stood up when standing up cost them something. Kids who were nominated by teachers, parents, or community members would receive recognition, mentorship opportunities, and educational funding. The program offered connections to local chapters where children could find positive male role models, learn about mechanics and craftsmanship, participate in community service, and understand what brotherhood really meant. But it went deeper than recognition. The program established a network of support for schools struggling with bullying, providing funding for comprehensive anti-bullying initiatives, training for staff, and resources for students who needed them. Jamal's beating, that moment of violence on a playground that could have been just another statistic in a country plagued by childhood cruelty, became a catalyst for helping thousands of children. His pain was transformed into purpose. His courage multiplied across communities that needed exactly the message his story carried. That one person standing up could change everything. That adults had a responsibility to protect the vulnerable. That justice mattered even when it was inconvenient for powerful people. If you believe one person can make a difference, share this video. Jamal's story needs to reach every kid who feels alone. 6 months after 670 motorcycles first rolled into town, they came back. But this time, everything was different. The club organized an appreciation ride with Jamal and Keisha Washington as guests of honor, a celebration of courage and the changes that had rippled outward from one small boy's decision to stand between cruelty and innocence. The morning began at the town square where the bikes assembled in formation, chrome gleaming in the sunlight, engines rumbling in that familiar thunder that had once signaled confrontation, but now promised something entirely different. Jamal sat in the sidecar beside Marcus's bike, his face beaming with excitement rather than fear. Keisha rode behind another club member, her arms wrapped around his waist, trusting these men who'd become family in the strangest and most beautiful way. When the procession began moving through town, something remarkable happened. People lined the streets, not hiding behind locked doors as they had that first morning, but standing on sidewalks and waving, cheering, holding signs that read, "Thank you, and we stand with Jamal, and real courage lives here." Children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Store owners stood in their doorways applauding. The same community that had feared the patches 6 months ago now understood what they represented. Protection, honor, accountability, and a refusal to let the vulnerable suffer in silence. The town had been transformed not just by policy changes in the school board meetings, but by a fundamental shift in understanding about what strength really meant and who deserved their respect. The ride culminated at the park where the Brotherhood had organized a community gathering. Families spread blankets on the grass. Food trucks lined the perimeter. Music played from speakers as children ran between the parked motorcycles, no longer afraid, but fascinated, asking questions, and getting patient answers from men who'd taken an oath to protect rather than harm. It felt like a festival, a celebration of healing and hope, and the power of showing up when it mattered most. Marcus called Jamal to the center of the gathering, and the crowd fell silent from a bag he'd carried with him. Marcus pulled out a vest, small, sized perfectly for a 7-year-old, black leather worn soft with care. It wasn't a club patch, not the kind earned through years of riding and proving yourself to brothers, but it was something more meaningful in its own way. Across the back, embroidered in silver thread, were the words, "Protected by 670 brothers." Marcus knelt down to Jamal's level, his weathered hands gentle as he held the vest open. "You showed us courage first, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion that he didn't try to hide. "You didn't know who Aliyah's dad was. You didn't know anyone was coming to back you up. You just saw someone who needed protection, and you stood up. That's the purest kind of bravery there is. This vest means your family. It means 670 brothers have your back, always." Jamal slipped his arms through the vest, and Marcus adjusted it carefully, making sure it fit just right. The boy stood there, small but no longer fragile, wearing a symbol of belonging that meant more than any trophy or certificate ever could. Keisha stood nearby, tears streaming down her face, watching her son being honored by men who'd shown him what it meant to be strong without being cruel, powerful without being oppressive. Aliyah ran forward and threw her arms around both Jamal and her father. The three of them caught in a moment of pure connection, a family forged not by blood, but by courage and protection, and the decision to stand up when everything said to walk away. The crowd erupted in applause, 670 bikers and hundreds of community members celebrating a child who'd reminded them all what mattered. The circle was complete. From violence to justice, from fear to understanding, from isolation to belonging. Marcus Carter stood in the park as the celebration continued around him. But for a moment, he stepped away from the noise and the joy to share something that needed to be said. His words were measured, thoughtful, carrying the weight of a man who'd lived long enough to understand what truly mattered and what was just noise. He spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from having your convictions tested and proven true. "People see the leather and think danger," he began, his voice steady and certain. "They see the patches, the motorcycles, the brotherhood, and they make assumptions based on movies and stereotypes in fear of what they don't understand. But brotherhood isn't about intimidation. It's not about violence or territory or any of the things people imagine when they see us roll through town. Brotherhood is about protection. It's about showing up when someone needs you, even if you've never met them, even if there's nothing in it for you except knowing you did the right thing." He paused, letting those words settle, his gaze direct and unflinching. Jamal protected Aliyah when no one else would. A 7-year-old boy stepped between a little girl and 3 bigger kids who wanted to hurt her. He didn't think about the consequences. He didn't calculate whether it was safe. He just saw someone vulnerable and decided that mattered more than his own safety. That's courage in its purest form. And when the system failed him, when the school chose money and influence over justice, when the adults who were supposed to protect him instead protected his attackers, we stepped in. We protected Jamal because that's what real strength is. Standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Marcus's voice carried the kind of conviction that couldn't be faked, couldn't be manufactured for cameras or public relations. Real strength isn't about how much pain you can inflict. It's about how much you're willing to endure to protect someone else. It's about using whatever power you have, whether that's physical strength, numbers, resources, or just your voice to make sure the vulnerable are safe. Jamal understood that at 7 years old, 670 brothers understood it when we dropped everything to ride through the night for a kid we'd never met. And now thousands of people across this country understand it, because Jamal's story reminded them that courage still matters, that standing up still matters, that one person choosing to do the right thing can change everything. He looked out at the gathering, at Jamal wearing his vest and playing with Aaliyah, at Keisha Washington finally able to smile without worry shadowing her eyes, at a community that had been transformed by being forced to confront its own failures and choosing to do better. This isn't about bikers or schools or any specific group, Marcus continued. This is about all of us remembering that we have a responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves. Children, the elderly, anyone who's vulnerable and alone and facing something bigger than they can handle. That's what brotherhood means. That's what community means. And that's what Jamal taught us all. His final words were simple, but carried the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had changed, everything that would continue to ripple outward from that moment on a playground when a small boy decided that doing right mattered more than staying safe. People see the leather and think danger. But when you really look, when you get past the surface and understand what we stand for, you see something different. You see men who remember what it means to protect. You see brothers who won't let courage go unrewarded or injustice go unchallenged. And you see a promise that as long as we're around, kids like Jamal will never stand alone. Closing and final CTA 58, Col 060, Col 00. So where are they now? Jamal Washington is 13 years old, thriving in middle school where he's known not as the kid who got beaten, but as the kid who stood up. He's an honor student with a particular talent for art. His sketches now filling notebooks with images of motorcycles and brotherhood and moments of courage he's witnessed or imagined. He's still best friends with Aaliyah Carter, their bond unbreakable after all these years. Two kids who understand what it means to protect each other, no matter the cost. Keisha Washington still works hard, but the scholarship fund has lifted a weight from her shoulders, giving her son opportunities she could never have provided alone. And she watches him grow with pride that sometimes overwhelms her. Ethan Brooks, now 19, volunteers with the stand-up program, mentoring younger kids who remind him of who he used to be. Angry, privileged, using power without understanding responsibility. He talks to them about the day 670 bikers showed him what real strength looked like, about standing in front of a gymnasium full of people who'd held him accountable when no one else would. He's studying social work at community college, trying to become the kind of person who prevents the harm he once caused. Redemption is a long road, but he's walking it. The school's bullying incidents have dropped 78% in the 6 years since that morning when motorcycles filled the streets. The policies implemented under national scrutiny have teeth. And more importantly, the culture changed. Kids learned that standing up mattered, that adults would actually protect them, that courage was rewarded rather than punished. And across the nation, the Brotherhood Stand-Up program has helped 2,400 children. Kids who protected others, who showed courage when it cost them something, who needed to know that their actions mattered, and that someone was watching, someone cared, someone would stand with them. Jamal stood up when it mattered. 670 brothers stood up for him. Now, it's your turn. If you believe in protecting those who can't protect themselves, subscribe to this channel. Let this story reach further, touch more lives, remind more people that courage still matters in a world that sometimes makes it feel like looking away is easier. Comment "Stand Up" if you refuse to let bullies win. If you believe that justice shouldn't depend on how much money someone's parents have. If you think that one person standing between cruelty and innocence can change everything. Your comment isn't just words on a screen. It's a statement, a moral stance, a declaration that you're on the side of the vulnerable, and you won't stay silent. Share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Maybe it's a kid who feels invisible in their school cafeteria. Maybe it's a parent struggling to protect their child from a system that keeps failing them. Maybe it's someone who's forgotten that courage still exists, that brotherhood still means something, that standing up when everything tells you to walk away is the truest measure of character. Because that's what Jamal taught us. Courage doesn't wear a patch. It doesn't ride a motorcycle, or carry a title, or need permission from anyone. Courage lives in the heart of a 7-year-old boy who saw someone in danger and decided that mattered more than his own safety. It lives in 670 men who dropped everything to show that childhood courage would not go unanswered. And it lives in you if you choose to stand up when your moment comes, because it will come. And when it does, remember Jamal Washington. Remember what happened when one small boy refused to walk away, and know that you don't have to face it alone. Stand up. The world is watching, and so are